What's up? Alexander here with Date Psychology. Today, Chapter 2 in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology. We're going to be talking about physical cues of partner quality. So this is the paper we're looking at, title of the same name. Physical cues of partner quality from the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships by Ian Stephen and Severi Luoto, I guess is how you say it. Terrible with names, but... Going on, we have a question to start with, okay? Why are some physical traits attractive? Some traits are attractive, some are not. Human beings do not mate randomly. We have pretty cross-culturally shared preferences for what is attractive and not, both physical, behavioral, and all of that. We're looking primarily at physical traits in this one. The question is why? Why did some traits evolve to become attractive and others not? Is it completely arbitrary, as some people have proposed? Could it just be culture? You know, do we have beauty standards that change by culture? Some things, sure, right? We have some things that are beautiful in some cultures or attractive that are possibly learned, but we also have very robust cross-cultural things, right, that are attractive kind of across cultures. You know, is this produced by biases in the visual system? There's kind of a hypothesis from cognitive psychology there. Some things, or is it that what is physically attractive signals cues of health or good genes, and these good genes could be physical or they could be behavioral, right? So physical traits can signal psychological traits, behavioral traits. Talked about this in a recent paper, not in this one, but there's a covariability of desire, a sort of positive manifold of desirability because we select desirable traits, both behaviorally and physically. So individuals who have certain physical traits, they might also have certain behavioral traits as well. Most of the research on this from the evolutionary perspective has looked at cues of health or good genes. So what might those be? Strong immune system, and again, as I mentioned, traits could also signal attractive behavior or personality. This hypothesis here is kind of guided evolutionary thinking about this. Most of the research has kind of taken this perspective. Do these signal good genes or health? That kind of a thing. Physical cues in the face of the body, they can be cues of partner quality, given that, right? And thus mate selection, right? They have these physical traits, I find them attractive. Finding something attractive is kind of the evolved mechanism for selecting that person as a mate. So this is also important. This means that the trait should be attractive and it should also reflect an underlying quality or a feature, okay, that is beneficial to fitness, to reproductive fitness. Twofold benefits in that case of attractive traits and selecting an attractive mate. One are direct benefits to the chooser. So if something like bodily muscularity or height is attractive, that could be, for example, a signal of protection. He's able to physically protect me from harm from other males or whatever the case may be. And then indirect benefits to the offspring. What sort of person am I reproducing with? And I'm selecting those good genes and passing them on to the offspring. Next slide. So we can break this down into 4 categories of cues, and we'll go through these in this video, okay? Cues of health during development. Did someone have a good developmental trajectory or a bad one, right? Did something happen along their development that has disrupted their developmental trajectory and produced less attractive traits? There's cues to the current condition of the mate. You know, is he fit in the moment? Is she fit in the moment to reproduce, to protect, whatever the case may be? Cues to the genetic quality of the mate. You know, does he have the so-called good genes to be passed on and selected for? And then also cues to the psychological or behavioral traits that the mate has. What does their physique, their face, their physical appearance tell us about their behavior, and how could that be beneficial? Next slide. So looking at some cues here to developmental health. Facial symmetry. This is something that we find is very robustly attractive in the research. There's been a good recent paper on this, not mentioned here, but it could also be just an effect of averageness. And when I say averageness, I don't mean someone who's of average attractiveness. I mean when you take a bunch of faces and you create a composite face that's also rated as attractive. So symmetry could also be averageness. There's some debate about that, but whatever the case may be, in this paper we're saying facial symmetry is something that's found to be robustly attractive across all of the literature, across cultures and all of that. We find even a preference for symmetrical mates in animals, a bunch of different animal species, primates as well. So we have a preference for symmetry, right? Human beings, one animal, other animals, they're not human beings, they seem to like symmetrical mates. Why might that be? Well, deviations from symmetry, particular facial symmetry, could reflect developmental disruptions, right? So something happens early in development, whatever, malnutrition, injury, exposure to pathogens perhaps these lead to disruptions in symmetry. So facial symmetry signals an underlying health. Perhaps the problem here is research on this hasn't been totally consistent or replicable. So we're not sure that this is really a real effect. Is symmetry really attractive because it signals health? We don't know that it's actually that closely associated with health. Some research says yes, some says no. There probably isn't a really robust association with health or with immunocompetence across the research, but there could be a small one, a small or a weak effect, right? Another one is sexual dimorphism. So that's the degree of masculinity or femininity in a face or in the body, right? More masculine features in a man, more feminine features in a woman. What shapes this? Largely it's exposure to prenatal hormones in development, right? So the exposure to androgens or sex hormones in the uterus, when the fetus is gestating. This continues to develop and it's pretty fixed by puberty, okay? So going up through puberty, exposure to hormones, that kind of thing, it can also further shape it. What do we know about this and attractiveness? High femininity, it's attractive in women, right? Pretty robust. The more feminine a female face, the more attractive it tends to be. High masculinity in male faces, on the other hand, not really the case. Those are not the most attractive faces for men. It's not the most masculine face that tends to be the most attractive or the most dimorphic face. It tends to be a face kind of in the middle. Medium high masculinity, in some cases facial femininity, men that are a little bit more baby-faced or a little bit more attractive, more neonatal, that kind of thing. So high sexual dimorphism in the face, not the most attractive faces in men. Let's go on now to the next slide. Facial femininity, as I said, very robustly attractive across the literature. This is shaped, as I mentioned, by high estrogen, and this does predict fertility. So this is probably a valid cue as far as signaling an underlying trait that is beneficial in that sense. Another one for cues of femininity in women, waist to hip ratio. We see that a waist to hip ratio of 0.7 is rated the most attractive. And there's some interesting papers on this, not mentioned in this chapter, that even look at paintings throughout history of different women, and you can have different women of different sizes and that sort of thing. But this waist-hip ratio remains pretty consistent as far as like what are beautiful women depicted as. So this may signal fertility, but again, not mentioned in this paper. A really good recent meta-analysis found, okay, it doesn't signal actual fertility. Women with an ideal waist-to-hip ratio don't actually have more children, but underlying hormonal structures associated with waist-to-hip ratio are associated with fertility. So perhaps there is something there. What else do we know about cues of femininity in women? Enlarged breasts are one. Okay, these are secondary sexual characteristics. Men find those attractive. It tends to be medium to large breasts. So small breasts and very large breasts rated as less attractive than medium to large breasts. Again, this is associated with higher estrogen. There is a downside to this, right, which is a higher risk of cancer, but perhaps, men have not kind of evolved to select against that, or perhaps that's why, medium to high as opposed to very, very high are more attractive. Also, firmer breasts, more symmetrical breasts, breasts with less ptosis or sagging, those are all rated as more attractive. Potentially signals of youth in that case, right? And we know younger women tend to be more fertile on average. Around age 25 is kind of peak fertility on average, and that declines a great deal by age 40. So these signs of youth, as far as, reflected in the breasts, that can also be kind of a signal of attractiveness that reflects underlying fertility. Anyway, next slide. Cues of masculinity in men. How are these related to attractiveness here? Facial masculinity, as I mentioned, there's no strong preference for high masculinity. The research tend to show the strongest preferences for mixed faces, so kind of moderate masculinity, moderate femininity, or even faces that are feminized a little bit. And when I say faces that are feminized, what do I mean? They take a face, right, with a computer editing software, and they make it look more feminine or more masculine. Or you can, use kind of an array of actual faces. Whatever the case may be, these are the kind of the results that manifest. The most dimorphic male faces or the most masculine faces, think of a face looking like a gorilla, not the most attractive. Now, why might this be? A lot looking at facial masculinity has examined it from this perspective of the immunocompetence handicap hypothesis. So the idea here is that sexual dimorphism is shaped by testosterone, primarily in the prenatal environment and then up through puberty. Past that point, additional testosterone does not really change the face very much. But we know that high testosterone is also a burden on the immune system. So you might ask, like, why is that good then? You wouldn't want something that's a big burden on the immune system, but that might mean that more masculine faces reflect a better immune system. So you have more of a burden on the immune system, but your immune system is good enough that it can handle it. So basically, highly masculine faces are saying he's got a lot of testosterone, he grew up in a high testosterone environment, his face is very masculine, and that means he has a great immune system, can fight off pathogens and that sort of thing. Problem is, again, this immunocompetence handicap hypothesis doesn't seem to replicate very well. Anyway, why are not the most masculine faces attractive given that? So a good explanation for this might be that highly masculine faces are associated with personality traits that are not ideal in long-term relationships. For example, aggression, a lower willingness to invest, higher short-term mating orientation or sociosexuality, that sort of a thing. And again, as we know across the evolutionary literature, women are highly oriented toward long-term mating strategies relative to short-term. There's, you can look at sex differences in sociosexuality or the distribution of sociosexuality among women. Most women are not very open or oriented toward casual sex. Conversely, most women really are strongly oriented toward wanting to form a long-term relationship. So if you have traits that signal like this is someone who might be less willing to form a long-term relationship, or someone who would be more willing perhaps to harm you in a long-term relationship, or even have the capability to do that, right? Because the evolution of highly dimorphic faces in men could be a product of contest competition. Fights with other men is what that is. More robust features that can take blows from a fist to the face. So that also means, okay, this is someone that can give a beating as well, right? This is someone that can take it and dish it out. They can hit me harder, etc., that kind of a thing. So there's kind of a trade-off there. Mate selection can be a trade-off here for good genes, in which case maybe it's high masculinity, but then also cues of behavioral partner quality, right? So lower aggression or being perceived as a better father, more likely to invest in the relationship, and all of that. Let's go on now to the next slide. So environments and hormones, their effect on masculinity. Do women prefer more masculine faces in more harsh environments, right? And so papers on this have looked at the effects of masculine facial preferences in environments that are poorer, countries that are poorer, that have higher rates of crime and all of that. Some research has found yes, that this could be beneficial, other no. So again, we kind of have these mixed and kind of inconclusive results here. We don't know that this is the case. Some research indicates yes, some no. Do women prefer more masculine faces when ovulating? And again, we talked about this in the last video, and I think as well, the whole video before that was about this. This is the dual mating hypothesis of ovulatory shifts. The idea that women have a primary partner who they select kind of for provisioning, mate care, long-term mating, but the evolved purpose of infidelity is to select the good genes of another mate on the side. And those good genes would be someone who's facially masculine. And the vast majority of research actually on this ovulatory shift hypothesis, dual mating hypothesis, has looked at facial masculinity. Do women have a higher preference for facial masculinity when they are ovulating? Basically, most of the research has produced null results here, or even negative results. So it doesn't seem to be the case. If there are any effects here, they're probably very weak effects, okay? But again, this is something that just simply has not replicated. This dual mate hypothesis of ovulatory shifts, as I mentioned in the last video, the originator of this hypothesis, Stephen Gangstead, he said he doesn't even believe in it anymore. So the same results have been found for masculine faces, muscular bodies. We simply don't see a preference shift toward these dimorphic traits when women are ovulating. At the very least, if there are positive results, they're very, very inconsistent. They're very, very weak. So yeah, this is something that hasn't seemed to have replicated very well. Quotation from this paper: the evidence that male facial masculinity is a valid cue to partner quality is therefore mixed or at minimum complex. Yeah, so highly masculine faces, dimorphism, doesn't seem to reflect underlying partner quality or good genes. At the very least, not robustly. It's not something conclusive here. We got to look elsewhere. Let's go on now to the next slide. What about adiposity or fat, right? Fat people. Okay, so what do we know? People can judge accurately the BMI of a person just from their facial photos. So, people who are trying to catfish you on Tinder, bad news for them. You can angle your face or whatever, people can tell. Faces that are of average adiposity, right? So faces that are not overweight or obese, neither underweight, are typically rated as the most attractive and the most healthy. And high adiposity or fat faces rated the least attractive. So bad news for the body positivity gang in the same point. We know that being overweight or obese, less attractive. Higher BMI You know, people criticize BMI. They say, oh, it's not a valid metric because look at this jacked bodybuilder. I mean, I'm close to obese based on BMI, but that's not the case for most of the population who is not like a jacked bodybuilder, right? They are not exactly people who are going to score very high in BMI, and in which case BMI still serves as a very good metric for health, for obesity, for the level of adiposity or fat that someone has. If you're very lean and you have a lot of muscle, maybe not. So higher BMI, it's still a very valid and robust cue for poor health. This is true across measures, cardiovascular measures, whatever the case you're looking at, hormonal measures, you know, diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. In men, high adiposity is linked with lower immune function. Not necessarily the case in women. Women seem to be able to carry a little bit more fat and still be healthy. For men, higher adiposity, even worse news. Facial ratio, which we know is associated with attractiveness as well, it's also impacted by fat, by adiposity. So we know that this also predicts cardiac health, BMI, and that sort of a thing. You know, kind of the advice people give, looks maxing communities or whatever, is like lose weight because it'll make your face look better. Yeah, I mean it will. Next slide, skin color and texture here, okay? An experiment they talk about in this paper, participants are given faces and they're allowed to adjust the tone of the face. They're asked, I want you to adjust the skin tone of this face to make it as healthy looking as you can. Participants make faces look lighter in color, all right? So they take darker faces, they make them look lighter, or, you know. Why might this be? We know that lighter faces are more able to communicate oxygenated over deoxygenated blood preference, and that's a sign of cardiovascular health as well, right? Like, is blood getting to your tissues well? It's associated with cardiac health. It's also associated with having sufficient nutrient sufficiency. So does someone have a good diet? This could be one reason why lighter skin color is preferred. This is also replicable across racial groups. So, you know, there are racial biases in dating. You know, white individuals tend to be rated as more attractive even across racial groups. There's an in-race preference, and there's also a preference across races for white individuals. So this is something that's replicable across racial groups. People will take this and they will try to make the skin a little bit lighter. The human visual system also is uniquely sensitive to changes in facial color. And there are probably like specific, you could call them modules. Certainly there's specific areas you can see in fMRI that are really like uniquely activated by faces, right? So the human visual system is sensitive to changes in the face, right? To signs in the face, including changes in facial color, discoloration, spots. It's not sensitive to that if you show just like a non-facial image with some kind of discoloration. So we are very attuned. We've evolved kind of a high sensitivity to recognizing things in the face. Let's go on here. So good genes, and this is the major histocompatibility complex, okay? Most research on this MHC has looked at this human leukocyte antigen, okay? What do we see? Having a heterozygous MHC, it's associated with a higher ability to fight off pathogens. And what we're talking about here is essentially genetic compatibility and attractiveness, okay? So if someone's healthier, if they have kind of this heterozygous MHC, they're probably better able to fight off pathogens, so they're gonna be healthier, which means what? They're gonna be healthier so they can provide direct benefits, like they're gonna be able to go out and acquire resources, they're gonna be fertile, they're gonna be able to, you know, gestate a baby in their body, and also indirect benefits. They're gonna pass those genes on to their offspring. Facial masculinity, once again, doesn't seem to predict this. Maybe there's a small positive effect, but like I said, you know, all of this research on facial masculinity doesn't get rated as more attractive. It's not robustly associated with most things. Body odor, on the other hand, it might. There's a little bit more on this. There's less research on this, but there's probably more of that research that shows a positive effect. We know that MHC heterozygotes, they tend to have less intense odor. So more pleasant odors, less strong odors as well. Another interaction here can be having a dissimilar MHC, okay? So this can also predict mate choice. And why might that be? If it's dissimilar, you have a higher chance of acquiring this heterozygous MHC loci. So if that's the case, you know, picking someone who's not too genetically similar or who's dissimilar from you can have a fitness benefit. There's mixed results here as well. They talk about some meta-analyses that find, again, small, null results. So maybe this isn't it. But not mentioned in this paper, you know, it could be that there's a sweet spot here where we like to select mates who are not too genetically similar, right? Kind of incest avoidance, that sort of a thing, passing on recessive traits, but also not too dissimilar. So there's an effect of compatibility, okay? Let's go on now to the next slide. Good genes and height. What do we know about this? Height, highly heritable. It's also a highly polygenetic trait, okay? So it's influenced by many, many different genes, but it's very, very highly heritable. You know, your height is very determined by the height of your parents. Female height doesn't seem to matter very much, not to the same extent that women prefer taller men, which is a stronger preference. Talks about some speed dating research in this chapter, okay? Women are more likely to choose men who are taller than them by a lot, actually, by 9.8 inches or 25 centimeters, okay? Tall men in these speed dating events more likely to get dates, and women also show a narrower preference or tolerance for height differences. So women might, have kind of an inflexible preference. Like, I will take a man who's between 5'10" and 6'2", and like outside of that is more of a deal breaker, where men are more willing to compromise, like, okay, I like this height, but I'll accept kind of any height, okay? Taller than average men, what do we know as far as observing kind of mating outcomes? They have more attractive mates on average, more likely to be married on average. If you look at sperm donors, that's a big one for what women pick. They want a tall man when they pick a sperm donor as well. What else do we know? Taller men tend to have better health than shorter men on average, according to this chapter. I think taller men do actually have a higher cardiovascular risk, not mentioned in this paper, but in general. What else do we know? Being big, better fighting ability, so the ability to win contest competitions, and also the ability to protect a mate, okay? There's a moderate correlation as well between height and intelligence, according to this paper. The correlations I've seen in past research is maybe more of a small correlation than moderate, but it exists, okay? And that can explain also perhaps why we see associations between height and status, higher wages. We know that height, is associated with making more money and that kind of a thing. There's also a curvilinear relationship with height. So you can be too tall. There gets to be a point, and they don't talk about what it is in this paper, where it's like too tall is less attractive than just being tall, okay? Average height men, on the other hand, so a white pill here for more average shorter men, they have higher reproductive success in some cases, so more children. Let's go on now to the next slide and continue with height, okay? Shorter women also have higher reproductive success than taller women. So, this can be an effect of assortative mating here. Shorter men are more likely to pair with shorter women, so they have higher reproductive success. Okay, that's something that we kind of observe. Now, I mentioned in the speed dating study, women kind of show this preference for men who are like 9 inches taller than them. Very high. Not mentioned in this paper, but there are some good papers looking at who do women actually pick. Okay, what is the actual height difference between partners? It's about 1 to 2 inches. So when it comes to actual mate selection, we actually see really strong assortative mating for height. People will actually pick mates who are really close to their own height. And that makes a lot of sense when you consider most men are taller than most women. And, people kind of want someone who's a little bit taller and all of that. Well, whatever. That's the way that it sorts out an actual mate selection. Women are not just flocking, to become kind of the harem of men who are 6'5" or whatever the case may be. At the end of the day, women are picking men who are kind of close to their own height on average. But taller men, going back to this, they could be more likely to have a slow life history strategy, which can explain fewer children on average, right? That's kind of a feature of the slow life history strategy. Why might that be? They say in this paper, perhaps it takes longer to develop. There's a higher metabolic cost of just being larger. We know there's a higher socioeconomic status associated with height, which is associated with a slow life history. We mentioned the relationship with intelligence. Improved immune function, also associated with a slower life history strategy. More likely to be married, slow life history strategy. So rather than tall men necessarily being like fast life history players, having sex with all of the women, we actually see more of an orientation toward long-term mating. So height can function as a cue of traits, both direct and indirect, right? Good genes, height itself, highly heritable, better immune function, higher intelligence, a better developmental trajectory in the past, because we know, that remaining 20% that is not heritable or, presumed to be caused by genetics is caused by the environment. You grow up in a poor environment with poor nutrition, you're going to be shorter than you could have been, okay? And can't go back and fix that, unfortunately. So higher status, perhaps it signals better current resources, that kind of a thing. This is actually true of female height as well. Higher socioeconomic status, slower life history strategy, and all of that. Anyway. Next slide, good genes and muscularity. What do we know? There's very high discrepancy between men and women in muscularity, particularly upper body muscularity and strength. People talk about, so they say humans are a low dimorphic species. Yeah, relative to like a gorilla or something, but men relative to women are much, much stronger. The median man is stronger than 99.9% of women, just the average guy who, is kind of skinny fat and doesn't work out or whatever. So sexual selection, when you see a big difference between men and women, it's probably a better explanation than natural selection, right? So that is to say that women are selecting preferentially men who are more muscular, as opposed to men who are more muscular being selected, that being produced by survival. Why? Because natural selection tends to act a little bit more equally on both sexes. What's beneficial for the survival of one organism that's male, also beneficial for the survival of an organism that's female. But sexual selection, there can be very different traits in what's desirable in a male and a female, okay? But there is a question across the research about muscularity. Is it intrasexual choice, women like muscular men, they're picking muscular men, or is it intrasexual competition, contest competition? Muscular men fight other muscular men, they physically remove them from the mating pool to monopolize the women. Did women pick it, or did men evolve it, basically, fighting one another? So we know, in support of the latter, men do accurately rate the fighting ability of other men from pictures. We also know that physical dominance in men predicts mating success. And in fact, physical dominance predicts mating success in men better than female judge sexual attractiveness. So what women find as attractive and rate as attractive is not as good a predictor of reproductive success as physical dominance is. Now, they mention this in the paper. I've also done a meta-analysis on this on the website. You might have seen it. But yeah, attractiveness doesn't predict having a lifetime number of sexual partners that's higher. It's a very, very weak effect. Physical dominance, on the other hand, really, really does. So there's stronger evidence here, perhaps, for male-male competition, at least on these points, than there is for female selection. But female preferences can also be at work here. They're not completely incompatible, the two, right? What do we know about female preferences? When you look at all of the research on what bodies do women pick, what do they like, it's a moderate level of muscularity. It's not like the most muscular bodies, right? So, you hear dad bod, I like the dad bod. Yeah, it's kind of what women are saying. Dad bod, of course, it's interesting because I asked men and women, I put up a picture of some men that an article had called a dad bod, and they were kind of fat men, and they were quite overweight. And I asked men and women, is this a dad bod? Men overwhelmingly said, yeah, that's a dad bod. That's what women think is a dad bod. Women said no. So when men think of a dad bod, they're thinking of a man who's kind of fat. When women think of a dad bod, they're thinking of a man who's kind of jacked, but, doesn't quite have visible abs yet. There's a big difference when, women say dad bod and men say dad bod. They probably mean different things. But the most muscular men in these studies are not typically what is picked as the most attractive. But the stronger men appear, the more attractive they are rated. So there is kind of that mixed result there that, if women think a man is physically strong, there's a linear relationship with attractiveness there. Anyway, going on. Next slide, more on muscularity. Why is muscularity attractiveness, okay? And then this is, assuming women pick muscularity. They find it attractive. Two reasons. One could be that it's a sign of health. The other could be that it's a handicapping signal. So, health. The more muscular men are simply the most attractive because they're healthier. High muscularity is a sign of health. Some research supports this. On the other hand, high muscularity could be a burden. It could be a handicapping signal, right? That it's harder to carry a lot of muscle. It requires more calories. It's more metabolically expensive. It could be associated, at high levels of muscularity with some health deficits. For example, men who are tall and muscular, as I mentioned, have a worse cardiovascular health, even if they're very lean. So that's kind of an issue. It could be a burden. So high muscularity could be a handicapping signal in that sense. And what does it say? I'm able to do this even though it's not ideal because, my genes are that good. They can support it. My immune system is that good. It can support it. Good genes equipped to handle that burden, basically. Some things not mentioned directly in this paper about muscularity, but that I thought I'd like to mention. Muscularity does help men to win these male-male competitions, but it also helps women to select men who can protect them from other men. So there's kind of the competition effect. More muscular men are able to win these contest competitions, push out other men, monopolize the women. But women also have an incentive for picking men who are strong and muscular, namely that, they can function as a bodyguard in that sense. Higher ability to protect is also a trade-off with a higher ability to harm. A man who's very big and strong can hit other men really strong, but he can also hit you very strong. So that can invoke a little bit of fear there. It can be intimidating and all of that. So there's kind of a trade-off, right, between these highly dimorphic features like extreme facial masculinity, as we mentioned, muscularity, and also the benefits that those could provide. Perhaps that is why, we see that women pick moderate muscularity as the most attractive, because it's kind of a mix. I think he's capable, he could, handle his business, but at the same time, he's not like a total brute who just simply poses a risk to me. Anyway, going on. Cues to personality, traits in the face. So, can we see personality traits in the face? Yeah, I mean, a lot of research shows that you can, that certain physical traits are associated with certain behavioral traits. And as I mentioned, I think I did a paper, or I didn't do a paper on this, I did a video on a paper on this with a huge list of evolutionary psychologists that participated on this paper, looking at a bunch of stuff across cultures. They found there was a positive manifold of desirability. So, traits that women find desirable are correlated with other traits. Women find industriousness attractive, kindness, bravery, those are correlated with physical attractiveness. Intelligence, correlated with physical attractiveness, okay? Why? Because if you have desirable traits across the board and more desirable people are able to pick each other, and we know that individuals of higher desirability, in another paper by these same authors, are also able to exercise their mate choice more effectively. Basically, they get who they pick more often. You're gonna see these traits, all of which are heritable, co-vary in the offspring, okay? So you get kind of a roll when you're born, and it's kind of like you get a good roll across the board or you get a bad roll across the board. It's not just mixed. It's not like a role-playing game like, well, I assign these many points to attractiveness, so therefore, my intelligence is very low. Unfortunately, nature's a little bit less fair than that. If you get good traits in one thing, you're a little bit more likely to get good traits in another as well. So, assortative mating here for personality. We know that people with similar personalities rate the faces of other with similar personalities as more attractive. And this is a blind rating. So you take a personality test like the Big Five, you're high in extroversion, and then you're presented with a bunch of faces, okay? You say, I like that face, I like that face, I like that face. Wow, you prefer people that are extroverted. Turns out all of those faces were people who were themselves high in extroversion. So we're kind of able to predict what we find attractive behaviorally by looking at the faces of other individuals, all right? So people can also accurately rate some personality traits from facial photos. You can look at a face and say, I think that's high in extroversion. I think that's high in the dark triad, or whatever the case may be. And there's some accuracy there, and not in the paper, but this can also be done with aggression, can be predicted from faces. And there's a lot of papers as well that are more controversial, but still it's a consistent effect that you can predict who has had a past history of crime. Like that person's more likely to have been convicted of a crime in the past, okay? So, at the same time, some traits don't predict behavior at all. We have some stereotypes. They're not entirely accurate. So we form this association, not accurate. Okay, what's an example of that? Large breasts do not predict promiscuity in women, but people rate women with large breasts as more promiscuous. Okay, so this isn't always the case that, this kind of ability to detect behavior and personality and physical traits is just like spot on. We can do it some of the time. Sometimes we also form erroneous impressions. Anyway. Next slide. So we've looked at physical traits and we've been talking about the body. But physical traits are also non-bodily things, right? The ornamentations that we put on ourselves, our clothes, right? Or the things that we acquire or the things that we do. So these are physical things, but they're not our body, okay? Your stuff, your clothes, your behaviors, the things that you produce, right? Cars, watches, your house. If you wrote a novel, right? Those are all kind of non-bodily things you've produced. Physical things that can signal, mating desirability or attractiveness, but yeah, they're not a part of your physical body. Anyway, important about these are hard to fake signals, which is important for signaling mate attraction, right? Because signals that are easy to fake don't reliably communicate information because, you perceive someone with something that's an easy to fake signal and it's like, well, it could not even be real to begin with, okay? Hard to fake signals are important in mate selection because it's like, okay, they have these things. That's not something easy to show if they did not have kind of the traits or behaviors or whatever that are able to acquire those things. So these tend to be things that are hard to produce, they're expensive, they're valuable, or they involve a high level of skill, right? So do you have a huge house? That's not an easy thing to get, right? You can't just say, I have a huge house. They'll be like, show me, where's the huge house, right? Do you have a famous YouTube channel, right? That could be another one. I don't have a famous YouTube channel, which is why you guys should like, subscribe, hit the bell, follow the channel. Let's make it famous. I need a hard to fake signal with a huge YouTube channel. Bodily ornaments are used to enhance attractiveness, often to enhance those kinds of features, right? Makeup, watches, jewelry that you wear. We know, revealing clothing in women, it signals sexual availability as well as sexual desire. When women score higher in sociosexuality, they dress more provocatively. When women are ovulating, there's some evidence that they pick different clothing. When women are more desirable of being married, whatever the case may be, they might choose to wear high heels. I think that's one example in this paper. There's a lot. I didn't want to go through all of them. Some of these ornamentations augment physical characteristics that are attractive as well, like makeup, right? So, if full lips are attractive, you can get lip fillers or you can put on lipstick or whatever the case may be. You're augmenting the physical traits. Some of these things showcase resources, right? So it's like a watch. Okay, is it showing off something just because it's like pretty? I mean, women kind of like watches on men, but if it's a Rolex, then you're like, oh, look at me, I'm also rich. Okay, so expensive jewelry, you can showcase your wealth through that. Other things as well, academic titles, for example, like, oh, you have doctor in front of your name, boom. Well, that's a really, really robust status cue across cultures. I mean, it's like one of the top ones. Two different ones were like, has an education and went to a prestigious school in the cross-cultural research of David Buss. So you also have things that are non-bodily things, physical things that signal status, right? Anyway, next slide, let's go on. Some more of these non-bodily traits. Interesting study here, kind of illustrates how this works. Same guy, they took pictures of him, in a fast food uniform and in a suit. What happens when those pictures are presented to women? Women rate the man in the suit as more attractive. It's the same guy, he looks the same, but he's wearing a suit, now he's more attractive, okay? Non-physical things, or I should say non-bodily things that are physical, your ornamentation, your clothing, enhances attractiveness, all right? This even works in conditions if you have like a good fitted suit versus a bad fitted suit, and it works for other ratings beyond just attractiveness. Like, okay, the man in the good fitted suit is also seen as more intelligent and more skillful and more competent, okay? Non-bodily cues of status, they seem to work especially well for men. They're not as important for women, right? What works better for women? Bodily ornamentation, things that enhance physical beauty. And of course, this reflects evolved sex differences here. Women are more long-term oriented. They're looking at other things that are not just like, he's pretty. They select for provision. They care a little bit less about attractiveness across the research, okay? Women, on the other hand, enhance their beauty because men value physical beauty highly, often just kind of blinded to anything but like, she is pretty. Men value looks a lot, so women enhance their looks a lot. Men don't seem to care as much about status cues in women and stuff like that. This is frustrating for women sometimes to learn that like men do not necessarily find having a high level of education more attractive, having a house, having a good career or an income. These things that make men attractive to women do not really make women attractive to men in the same way. And in fact, some of these things can even kind of be detrimental. And we'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide. Traditional dating norms as well, right? Where the man invites the woman on a date and he's paying for the meal and all of that. This is not just something that was invented recently. This also reflects kind of our evolutionary history. This is something that you see in animals, in non-human primates, a direct trade of resources for sex. Let's go on, next slide. So what do we see kind of in a modern environment with that, right? The foodie calls, the so-called foodie calls, which is, women that go on a date with a man just because they want to get a meal. There was a couple of papers on these. One of these found 33% of women, so a whole third of women, have gone on Tinder dates just because they wanted a free meal. There's no such thing for men, basically, right? Men are not doing this. Women are doing this, right? So it reflects kind of those evolved sexual strategies, where men are trading resources for potential sexual access, and women are realizing, consciously like, this is kind of a thing that's happening. I can kind of exploit that, okay? What else do we see? Sex differences and kind of this preference for attractiveness. 47% of women, but only 35% of men say that they could imagine marrying someone who's not good looking. So again, we see men have this stronger preference for attractiveness, particularly kind of as a deal breaker. Like, I could not imagine myself with an unattractive woman. Women are kind of like, yeah, I could see that if these other things are good, okay? Creativity, we've talked about, some very physical things like having a nice house or a Rolex or painting your face with makeup or whatever the case may be. Creativity is also rated as highly attractive and is a really robust status signal, again, across cultures in the work of David Buss. So, we're talking about these things that enhance beauty or signal resources. Creativity probably showcases skill and intelligence and other things, even potential for, resource acquisition, things that make someone a potential good mate. So we're talking about like the production of valuable works, art, invention, discoveries, literature. We know, for example, that male artists, pretty much across whatever kind of art you're looking at, they do have more sexual partners on average. And this is true even for writers. You think like writing is not very sexy. Yeah. Writers have more sexual partners on average. Okay. Men also produce many more creative works than women do, kind of across the board. Why might that be? Why do we see men producing all of this creative work and women not? If we look at it kind of from this evolutionary perspective, because the production of these creative works is essentially signaling to women in competition with other men, right? Like, I'm doing this thing that makes me valuable as a mate. Women perhaps are not considered as valuable by men when they do those kinds of things. So there was less pressure to evolve that, I guess. We see, for example, men write more fiction, women consume more fiction. So, women also tend to kind of be the consumers of these creative endeavors that men produce in that sense that are attractive to women. Kind of like the exchange of food, you know, in that case that we talked about. Let's go on now to the next slide. So we looked at these things, and the final part of this paper was just kind of touching on what are called evolutionary mismatches in mating. So sex differences in mating preferences, they persist into the modern time, even though culture has changed radically. And some of these preferences might not even make that much sense now, right? It's important to understand, you know, why don't men care about female wealth as much as in the modern environment as men do? Maybe men should, right? I mean, if you have two high earning partners, there's better potential provisioning for offspring or that kind of a thing. It's not necessarily an ancestral environment, you know, where the woman is like burdened with pregnancy and can't do anything and the man must provide. Everyone can now. So why do men care very little about income in women and women care more than men do relative to that? Well, you know, we evolved our mating preferences in the past, way in the past, over many, many generations, our human ancestors in the Pleistocene, okay? And they might not have caught up with modern conditions, and that produces this evolutionary mismatch, where the kind of behavior or mate preferences we see now can even reduce reproductive fitness. They're no longer adaptive, but we're kind of stuck in those behavioral patterns and desires and things that we evolved in the past, right? Evolution is kind of always a step behind the environment, right? And then evolution is expressed on the environment changes. Some of these organisms are kind of adapted for it and they're doing well, some of them are not, that kind of a thing. So I said some of these things can reduce fitness. So an example of that might be like high status, high education in women. We know from like some research on dating apps, women that are very high in status and education and that sort of a thing, high income, they might actually struggle to date a little bit more. Men actually swipe left on their profiles, but also they might be more selective. And what does that mean when they're more selective? You know, if women have a preference for men who are a little bit higher in status, higher income, but they're kind of at the top of the game, they're gonna have a very small mate pool to choose from. They don't wanna select down, but selecting down might actually be, you know, what is actually conducive to reproductive fitness in that case. And of course, technology changes the game. We evolved in an environment with in-person interactions, groups of, you know, 100 people. You live in a small village. You live in a small group of hunter-gatherers and foragers and that sort of thing. All of your mate assessments are being made in vivo, face-to-face. You're able to select, you know, I see their face and how attractive they are, but I also see the way that their body moves. I see the way that they speak. I see the way that their voice sounds. And also I know their whole history of what they've done across their life and what they produce and what kind of person they are. All of those things are evaluated holistically. They're not just evaluated like one by one or independently of each other. They all kind of come together. Technology changes that. Think of something like a dating app, a very strange modern invention. There's a lot of cues that are completely missed. You just see a face and you're like, face, I like it. Face, I don't like it. Face, I like it. That kind of a thing. So you're missing all of these other cues, and that can produce kind of a premium for certain things. On a dating app, what really is the predictor of who gets more matches and that kind of things? It's simply physical attractiveness, okay? You know, and there's research that shows, yeah, if a man has a bio, it increases matches by like 3 times. Those things matter also. You know, if a man showcases that he has a higher level of education, a higher level of income, that also gets more matches. But there's a lot of information that's missing in these weird modern environments that present mates to us that would not have been missing. So we kind of have, you know, perhaps certain elements of mate selection emphasized in modern environments that would not have been in the past, that are kind of producing a premium for certain things like physical attractiveness. Anyway, I think that is the last slide. This is the last slide. This was chapter 2 in the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Romantic Relationships. Like the channel, subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon with a Discord and all of that. Join, support the project. I will make another video for you very soon.